Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Politics Relaxed. Thank you, first of all, to Marcos and Jerry for joining me. They are the authors of the new book, Uncomfortably Off, Why the Top 10% of Earners Should Care About Inequality. So, first of all, thank you very much, and congratulations on the book. It's really interesting. I've read it, and I would recommend all our viewers to go and read it after watching this interview. I'll start with why did you choose the top 10% of earners? I know you kind of cover this in the book, but just for our viewers, why the top 10%?
Mm. Um, I guess, well, there's a practical answer and there's a more sort of theoretical answer to that.
Mm.
The practical one is that we were both commissioned to work on a think tank report, which was specifically on this issue from a sort of left of center point of view. We're funded by FEPS, which is associated with the SPD, for instance, in Germany, with the PSOE in Spain, with the traditional socialist parties, but
Yeah.
sort of to the left of that in the European Parliament. So that's the more practical reason. The more theoretical reason, I guess, there's at least two as well. One is a bit more general, and a bit more personal.
Mm.
The more general one is perhaps that when you look at a lot of research in sociology, when you're looking at, for instance, political attitudes or attitudes to, for instance, trust in government, how often do they vote, those kinds of things, it's very often the case that you separate the income distribution in deciles. But perhaps the top decile is almost by definition the most diverse
Mm.
because it includes people close to the threshold who earn, as we say, close to 60,000 pounds a year
Yeah.
compared to billionaires, right? So we kind of wanted to open that black box and see what's going on there. That on the one hand, and on the other, as we explain in the introduction of the book as well, we thought that, especially as we started doing the interviews, that this group was really interesting in that the views are both on the left and on the right, even though
Yeah.
a majority were kind of center right, sounded like the prevailing common sense, whilst at the same time they really didn't have any idea where they sat in income distribution. So, and at the same time as they sound like the prevailing common sense, they also often, when we went into the questions of politics, felt besieged. I guess because of all
Yeah.
those
Yeah.
reasons, we thought the top 10% was interesting.
Mm.
I'd also add, I like the way Anoush Shakalian at our launch event at LSE, I like the way she put it. She said, this group are understudied, that they need to be
Mm.
uncovered. So she would, as a reporter, probably go to a food bank over going to Canary Wharf, which is where we started
Yeah.
our interviews. And there are good reasons for that, but it's meant that they are an under-researched section of the population. So
Yeah.
yeah, we're filling a gap with our book, we hope. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and it was interesting reading the book. You mentioned the possible title of Never Good Enough before eventually
Oh,
settling
yeah.
on Uncomfortably Off. I wonder,
Yeah.
kind of delving into that name, why did you pick it, and what maybe some of the other options you thought about?
Oh, okay. I think Jerry came up with a comfortably off. I can talk about the other two.
Yeah, okay. Here you go first.
Okay, I'll go first. So, never good enough. Um, I guess in particular in relation to that point we make in chapter 3, which is around work and the fact that you always have to, be moving upwards in your career. There's this idea very often in this ethos of working hard, of basically being efficient and being successful, that is associated with a lot of the ethos of the top 10%. I think they
Yeah.
generally tend to have very meritocratic views, but that's the underbelly of that, if you will. The dark side of it can be a certain sort of neuroticism, I guess.
Mm.
That's what I was drawn to. Another title that we thought about that I really liked as well was The Politics of the Relatively Well Off, relatively in italics,
Mhm.
because relatively obviously it's such a murky word that
Mm.
allows you to think about this group that they may be. I mean, if you ask them, they also will say relatively because it's always
Yeah.
relative in
Yeah.
relation to the fact they're always looking upwards, looking at those who are a tiny bit or very much ahead of them in income terms.
Mm.
On the uncomfortably off, well, obviously it comes from, oh, they're very, well, what do your neighbours do? Oh, I don't know, but they're very comfortably off. It's kind of like that phrase you use when you always like see the people around you as you think, oh, they must earn more than me, they must be wealthier, that constant kind of keeping up with the Joneses. And then but under the surface of that, you've got the James Perry, who wrote our foreword, put it really well. James Perry set up B Corps, and he's also part of Patriotic Millionaires pressure group, which I'd really encourage you to follow as well, to look at what people are trying to do about wealth taxes. But he put it as being on a hamster wheel. So the part of this, it's very natural human impulse to always look up and to see the grass is greener. But underneath, you've got this sort of anxiety about I'm never good enough. It's all connected. So on the surface, you're like, oh, they're comfortably off. They've got their family car. They go to wherever on holiday once a year. But underneath, it's like, am I good enough? So and so is earning more than me. Will I be able to keep earning that much? And I just wanted to add one more thing to never good enough. This is what we're seeing, and Danny Dorling pointed this out to us, inequality expert professor in Oxford, that actually the relationship of the top 10%, the older top 10% with their children is actually something really interesting to look at, because the children are feeling that they're not good enough because they won't be able to copy the stages of life that their parents have gone through. And so they'll have to make different choices. They won't be able to marry at the time. They won't be able to have the children at the same age their parents had. They won't be able to buy a house as their parents did. So it's the feeling of, oh, the children of the top 10% feeling, am I good enough for my parents? And there's that dynamic going on as well. Maybe we should call it never good enough.
No, and definitely coming on to that, I mean, in my notes here, I've written about that generational difference and young people, especially as a young person and kind of as a podcast about young people, I thought it would be really interesting to kind of explore that idea of the generational differences between the people with wealth at the minute and the young people that are kind of growing up in the world now.
We'll probably both answer that, Marcus. Do you want to go first? Because I've just spoken.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we can continue in this order. You immediately reminded me of a quote that we have in the book of this woman who works in, I believe it's a management consultancy, who is quite high up in her own career. And she says that the route that she used to get where she is at the moment is not open in the UK. Now it's done in India.
Got it.
Yeah, I found that particularly interesting in relation to, as Jerry was saying, the amount of expectations and the weight of expectations that you're putting on young people to basically allow them to reproduce the social position that their parents had, because ultimately the way that we tend to think about our own life trajectories is precisely in relation to how well you did in relation to your parents. There's a very good book that we cite as well. It's called Privilege Lost. It's based on the US by Jesse Stribe. I really recommend it. It's basically around how different strategies that parents have to raise their children and different sort of personality types of their children coalesce into actually having some children of the upper middle class not necessarily being able to reproduce their social position. For example, you could think of, for instance, the children of I don't know, the children of doctors, for instance, who want to move into another career, say into the arts, for instance. Okay, but also the fact that certain careers are basically not necessarily having, even though they're traditionally considered to be upper middle class, and not necessarily allowing the same level of social reproduction that they used to in the past. Medicine is again a very good example. You may have heard also of, junior doctor strikes, or the strikes of barristers as well in London. Jerry?
Another book I'd really recommend, which I got out thinking about this call, is Generation Left by Keir Milburn. It's really, really good. And I said that I'd have to put in a call for PR in this call. And I was reading his conclusion, and he says here, we face something like a catch-22 in achieving this vision, which is his vision of a more egalitarian society. At the moment, we have neither the time nor the resources to participate fully in democracy. As a result, most participate episodically, if at all. Remember, we've said that high earners, they participate more, they're more likely to vote. but younger people, more of us are not. Yet a lack of participation ensures governments are run on behalf of the capitalists who will always want to make us work harder and longer for less. It's a negative feedback loop. So I think democratic reform is kind of the main thing that I would focus on if I was 20 years younger, because really without that falling into place, nothing systemic is going to happen. We'll get maybe a good Labour, one term, and then it'll be back to, frankly, God knows what. So yeah, I've done my plug for democratic reform, and it really is the base of all other systemic change. So if you're going to ask me what I think is most important, I'm going to say democratic reform. Also in the book, we point out to so this breaking down of the meritocratic rationale. So there was a distance between those who do well and those who don't, and that's a reward for effort, but the link is weakening. And if you think about what have older people benefited from, we list them in the book: rise in value of homes, generous pensions, healthy wage growth, free university tuition, tax breaks for savings and capital gains, triple lock on state pension. I mean, where do you stop? So it is a real generation thing, but it doesn't mean to put one generation against another, because that won't get it. That's distraction again. That's all.
Yeah.
Sorry, the end.
I mean, I want to come in on this idea of meritocratic society and whether it exists anymore, because a lot of the people you speak to in the book are they're very set on this meritocratic idea of society, and that's what they want. And I think that there's a few contrasting views on whether it exists or not. And I know, I think certainly looking at the statistics now, less and less, it looks like people can have social mobility. And yeah, I just think it was interesting hearing about the views of the top 10% on meritocracy and whether it exists anymore. And I wonder if you kind of expand on that a bit.
Yeah, sure. I think a majority would say they believe in meritocracy, yes. Yeah. But also many of them would recognize the fact that it's not operating as well as it used to. The main exception would be, I'm thinking of a few particular interviewees who were very much invested in this idea of moving upwards, that nobody taught them how to whether to go to university, etc., how to start a business, that kind of thing. So that probably some of the interviews with the most acute sort of upward mobility would be the ones more invested in the myth of meritocracy.
Yeah.
Which I completely understand. Also, there's perhaps a distance that people understand between the myth and the reality of meritocracy. And interestingly enough, that sort of reveals, I think, a very interesting dimension about the top 10%, but not in particular them, but it's just how humanity is, I guess, which is the distance between what they say they believe and action, in particular in relation to the fact that the more, if Thomas Piketty is correct, so that the returns from owning, from wealth, are becoming ever more important in relation to the returns from working, your wages, then you have an interest then, as someone who's a relatively high income earner, to turn as much as possible from your income into wealth, right?
Yeah.
And that's, if you think about it in generational terms, it's going to create inequalities, are going to mean that it's not going to be an even playing field. And I think from the millennials onwards, perhaps, you're seeing that a huge part of where they end up in life is precisely the capacity, depends on the capacity to rely on wealth. So a very good example of this is the Horizon. Sorry, they talk about what they call the bank of mom and dad, which is basically having the broad family having enough wealth and enough resources to be able to help their children be part of a unpaid internship, for instance, so just live in London for a few years looking for a job, and that will allow them to enter into these, prestigious occupations, and will help them get a leg in. Obviously, there's many problems in relation. There's a lot of debate on inequality in relation to the cultural professions, which we could go into, but also that is predicated also on the risk that you're not going to be able to, even if you get a leg into one of these professions, it seems like the status of these professions is going down as well. So the more you're going to ultimately end up relying on wealth anyway.
Yeah, we're definitely seeing obviously everyone's talking about the shift away from an economy where, outcomes for individuals and families, so for the older top 10% were largely based on jobs, towards an economy, like Marcus says, when outcomes are largely based on assets. So, what that's going to do to the meritocratic myth, because it is a myth, I don't know, but watch this space. It's cracking in front of us.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I saw I was at LSE today and I watched Sam Friedman.
Yeah,
So
I was there
Oh,
too.
right.
Yeah,
oh
yeah,
really? Oh
yeah, yeah,
wow.
yeah. Not in person, sorry, online.
Oh, got it. Yeah. No, yeah. Um, another kind of thing I really picked up on the book was this idea of community and the loss of community, especially with the top 10%, and the fact that they don't particularly have connection with the other lower, especially lower income earners, and that loss of connection. And I wonder how you think kind of we bring that link back, if it existed at all.
That's a
Mm,
really good question. Um,
yeah.
So I've got the original report's policy recommendations here, because it may look like quite a dry document, but I actually think the work we did on it was really good.
Yeah.
And some of the things that we recommended were to improve public understanding of the negative consequences of inequality. So until people understand that, that it's not just problems for the poor, environmental breakdown, problems for everyone, until that gets into the public consciousness a bit more. So any public I think will help that. To promote the importance of public services to the top 10%, which is the same sort of idea, because at the moment they sort of have this idea it's a sort of status thing that they don't need them. So actually sort of explaining that through the life course we all make use of public services, so that would and not feeling less of themselves for using them, that would make them interact with different groups in society. um we've got some other ones, Marcus.
Yeah, sure. So I would put it like this. So where would we generally tend to interact with people who are not in a not a direct family? Generally, I think it's probably traditionally the church or religion, but that is in the wane generally. Perhaps hobbies, but that hobbies will not necessarily mean that you will interact with people from different social strata. Perhaps a few like sports, for instance, may be a good example. But in general, the two main ones and the two most important ones are work and education. And work and education are also the most important sociological characteristics to define this top 10%. I mean, the amount of professionals and managers concentrated in the top 10%. Not that all the professional managers are in the top 10%, but that all professors, most of the top 10% are professionals and managers, just to make that important distinction. And also, if you compare it to the rest of the groups, they tend to have spent more years in education. Okay, so
they're not the places necessarily where they'll meet different income groups, are they?
Yeah, no, they're not. Especially the more, you need to access, say, for instance, elite educational settings, the more they rely, for instance, on private education. And the more, depending on the kinds of jobs, but a lot of the jobs of the top 10%, say, for instance, in finance, will be catering to people just as wealthy or even wealthier than them. There are a few exceptions, for instance, doctors and their patients, but a majority perhaps would be interacting in the relation to colleagues. And in relation to their colleagues and their patients or clients, they're going to be linked to people who are just as wealthy as them. So I would say, and I think this is one of the conclusions of the book, and this was very vague perhaps, but I think that's not necessarily a bad thing, is that a lot of the efforts that we describe in chapter 3, where we talk about never good enough, work is life, all that kind of thing, is ultimately an attempt to differentiate yourself from the 90%. And first of all, that perhaps we would want, if society weren't as unequal as it is, perhaps being part of the 90% wouldn't sound as scary. On the one hand, and on the other, maybe sometimes do a bit less to differentiate yourself from them.
Exactly, and you could differentiate yourself, like do less by doing and do different. So I found it one of our recommendations was invest in local economic, civic, and democratic initiatives that facilitate interaction across the income distribution. And we give examples like democracy forums, national volunteering schemes, so different from corporate social responsibility, something like near your home, not linked with work. Participatory budgeting, so sort of local stuff, which I think we are going to see the development of because of working from home more and all those sorts of trends.
Yeah, I mean, just touching on kind of what you talk about in the book around this erosion of kind of one democratic functions like political parties and those sorts of arenas for people to kind of interact with the community and people outside of their kind of income sphere has just been eroded, and I think that's kind of what's got to be brought back in.
Yeah, but it's all to do with the fact that we're on Netflix and then we get in our car and drive somewhere, and then everything is very insulated and individualistic, and I don't know how we start breaking that.
Yeah, I mean, another kind of key issue that's discussed is about overconsumption, and I think especially kind of as young people being worried about the environment and climate change, which are these big issues that we're going to have to face. I mean, the top 10% play a pretty big part in that, right?
Yeah. Yeah, they do.
Yeah, I don't remember the stat off the top of my head. I can get it. I can rustle around and find it. But yeah, they're big emitters, and yet they won't. When we interviewed them, they won't bring up the subject of climate change unless asked. But if they do ask us, always we're very and yet they're big emitters. So because this, as Marcus was saying, you were saying, conspicuous consumption, keeping up with the Joneses, differentiating themselves through consumption. And as you get more anxious, and I'm not good enough, I'll just spend some more, and then I'll feel a bit better. And then you get this what do they call it? Post-consumption dissonance, I think they say. So you feel very good when you just clicked the Amazon button. You always feel good, you've got your new thing, and then you get your new thing, and then you realize, oh, it doesn't make me feel any different or happier, and then you get that drop, but it doesn't stop us from constantly hitting that button, does it? And the top 10% do that as much as anyone else, if not obviously more. So yeah, that's another really tricky one.
yeah, it's very tricky. As
I don't know how bad it has to get. I'm not sure. It's obviously not bad enough.
Yeah. As Jerry said, the top 10% are interesting in that they declare, even in surveys, to be probably among the most the groups that are the most worried about climate change, and nonetheless they are among the largest carbon emitters. That is absolutely true. I think the one thing that I would add is perhaps that not necessarily all the top 10%, but a lot of it is quite inimical to sort of forms of collective action that would perhaps allow you to tackle climate change. I mean, that's not necessarily our area, but those forms of climate action might be actually, I mean, some of them might be even punitive, or at least impinge on sort of things that they consider their rights in the past. One thing that we think that most of the top 10% share, perhaps all of them, is what we call small L liberal attitude towards everything, which basically means that if you've proven yourself to be a responsible enough adult to basically carry on with your life and be able to sustain yourself and your family, that means that the state should leave you be.
Yeah, and academics, which is why no one's written a book, and journalists, which is why they never write themselves. It's the same thing. It's the point we make really early in the book. The top 10% dominate the public conversation. They're the ones that write the articles. They're the ones that write the books. But their view is that they're almost invisible because they're everywhere. It's that double thing. Yeah.
So it has to do with that sort of distance that they see between themselves and anything that touches on the sort of everyday life very often, like
you're right. Because if we asked about trade union membership, about protests, I remember the one guy that said, "Oh, I wanted to go on a Brexit protest, but my wife wouldn't let me."
Yeah,
it's
I
like
remember
I mean, it's not to laugh, because protests, if you haven't been on one, it can be first experience is quite powerful, but it's not having that sense of you are part of the structure. There's
And I guess having that attitude of being a small L liberal and the fact that you don't want to be touched by the state is a bit of a dangerous narrative to have when it comes to inequality, because on things like taxation, or I mean, if if you want the top 10% of earners to buy into taxation and then to buy into public services, the only way you can do that is to bring them in and into this kind of community spirited idea. And I guess that's not really happening if they believe that they're kind of separate from the state and the state shouldn't really be touching them.
Well, I might be sounding old because I'm a bit older than Marcus, but I do genuinely think it's going to come through their children. I do.
Yeah.
Because it's either going to be understand where your children are coming from or lose touch with your children. And Daniel Dorling wrote the foreword to the original report, and he was saying, if you're not convinced by, people like John Hills, who should definitely read if you're interested in this, who shows that through your lifetime we are all largely equally dependent on the welfare state, directly and indirectly.
Yeah.
That you have to have a longer term view of the dynamics of it all. If you're not convinced of that, when you're elderly and you're in your care home and you're feeling very vulnerable and your children live in Australia because they, or wherever, because they're Asia, because they had to move, and then you're thinking who's going to care for you and what's the quality of care going to be like, I'm hoping people will realize sooner than that. But as care becomes more important because the value of other work declines, and and care work and domestic work can't be reduced, its efficiency can't be reduced. It's a high value, qualitative experience which won't improve by reducing the money spent on it. Care will become more important. I don't know how, like I said, I don't know how bad it has to get before people really start to understand what the future holds. I just hope it's not too late. I hope it's not when they're sitting in their care home neglected. And
Yeah.
I don't mean to put a pessimistic note on it.
Yeah, no, that's fine. You reminded me of Max Planck, the famous German physicist, had this quote on how scientific change happens. Actually, I was just looking at, I was just reminded of it, and I looked at and I was looking for the quote. Here it is. A new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it. So yeah, that's a possibility.
On death.
I mean, perhaps like the two ways that you can think of sort of general sort of intellectual change is either with say a massive upheaval that makes it completely impossible to go back, something like the fall of the Berlin Wall, for instance, or yes, slower generational change, although we don't really know at this stage if we actually have time for that. I'm more interested in this.
I just think more and more people are questioning, capitalism. They're understanding that it's not an invisible hand. It's actually people, telling stories to people and convincing them and selling them a story. And then, I think people are, even within the establishment, are thinking, well, hold on a minute, this system's not working as we thought it was going to work. So I think it might self-implode, but capitalism does well with crises, doesn't it? Oh, and while I'm on here, I'm going to plug this latest book because it's amazing. This guy called Soren Mao, Mute Compulsion. It's absolutely brilliant. You've got to read it.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in relation to the generational point as well, that perhaps it would be better to focus on a younger cohort, perhaps, because it's easier for them to go in on one way or another. I remember recently I mentioned this in the LSE launch that I saw this discussion on Twitter, I think, in relation to income tax, and showing how the difference between your after-tax income in different countries, and it was comparing positively working in the UAE, in Dubai, compared to working in the UK. Because in Dubai, basically, income tax is almost non-existent. But then that's a completely different model of society, obviously. But it has a certain logic to it. If you are like staunchly meritocratic, or a certain idea that you are absolutely your own individual, from a sort of libertarian perspective, it makes complete sense. And the thing is that as you coming to adulthood, start paying your taxes, start having to worry about rent, that kind of thing, you can either think that you will see that the results of inequality is so high that you will see that the myth and the reality of meritocracy and the chasm is growing larger and larger. But then you have at least two competing explanations. One of them is the one that we'll probably will try to defend in our book and defend in general, which is in relation to wanting to strengthen the social safety net, wanting to strengthen collective institutions, etc., wanting to strengthen the power of labor in relation to capital, ultimately, if you want to put it in Marxist terms. And another one would be to say that all these things are distractions, or ultimately are, dead weights that doesn't allow you to succeed, ultimately. And I see that, for example, I'm touching wood, but very famous sort of libertarian social media star is very possibly going to be a very competitive candidate in the next election in Argentina, for instance.
What about the air though in Dubai? What
yeah, there's that
like?
too.
What
Yeah.
are the parts? They haven't got any part. What's the water like? It's just externalities. Externalities need to be sexed up again. People need to properly understand externalities.
Yeah, I guess kind of as a closing question, what do you want to see from this book? Maybe in policy terms, maybe in kind of belief shifting in the top 10%. What sort of change would you want to see after kind of writing this book and exploring this issue?
Shall I go first?
Yes, go ahead.
Probably, like, if anyone's going to read any of it, I like the chapter we wrote on when the facts change, I change my mind. And the subtitles of those in this are question business as usual. And so probably if I had to take just one message from the book, it's just question what you're told, and also question each other when if it's your mother-in-law and she loves reading the Daily Mail and she says something back at you about it and you go, is that true really? Not in a confrontational way, but have those conversations. In fact, have those uncomfortable conversations, get out of your comfort zone, I'd say. And, and also trying to get the point that politics is everything. I've met a lot of people because I was a parliamentary candidate in the 2019 general election. And I'd go to a lot of doors and people would say, or to parents, because I had young children at the time, oh, I don't do politics, like a real lack of confidence. Yeah. Everyone does politics, and I think that's become so clear in the last few years, just to encourage that conversation. Politics is how much you spend at the supermarket, so everyone does politics. So just to say, have a view, question things. That's probably what I'd say.
Yeah. I'd say too as well. The first one is very much related to what Jerry just said, which is we're trying to elicit what we call sociological imagination, quoting that famous sociological mantra concept of basically knowing where you stand and knowing how the experiences in the life that you've become accustomed to, they're not necessarily that common. So be aware of the fact that you shouldn't necessarily assume that everyone had the same opportunities as you. So maybe don't, because for instance, I was misquoting Daniel Edmiston before. He wrote a really good paper, basically, where he compared how people in the top decile and the bottom decile react to scenarios of people facing difficulties in their lives. For instance, young woman who cannot find someone to take care of the children whilst they need to go look for work, so they're having their benefits reduced. I think that's one of the scenarios. People in the bottom decile will completely understand that and actually be able to put themselves in that position. In that sense, they had a better view, even though obviously, if you look at all the indicators, they have less education, etc. But they knew about the structural constraints that people face in society, whereas people in the top 10% didn't necessarily, and instead they would say, like, you made a terrible decision, and put it in meritocratic terms, saying basically that she deserved what happened, this hypothetical person. So sociological imagination is one. And the other one that I would really like to, and I hope that the title conveys it, is that even if you're in the top 10%, particularly closer to the bottom of the top 10%, you're not necessarily doing as well as you thought you would. And actually allowing to sort of the possibility of social reproduction is becoming weaker and weaker. And you have two options. One is to basically create a bunker and try to amass as much wealth as possible and insulate or isolate yourself as much as possible from the looming threats to your social position, or maybe make it not that terrible to be part of the 90%.
Yeah. I mean, thank you very much for the time. I want to say Uncomfortably Off, Why the Top 10% of Earners Should Care About Inequality, should be in all good bookstores or on Kindle, and you can go and buy it. Is there anything else you guys want to promote? What's coming up for you guys?
I'm actually about to do a report with FEPS, the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, on young people's views and relationship with democracy in Europe. So I'm really, really looking forward to that, because I'd like to see, having done that, maybe to do some similar work in Britain. So I'm very interested in young people and democracy at the moment. Yeah.
Yes. And yeah, I'm doing research on think tanks. That was originally my field, but in the next few weeks we'll be discussing with our outlets trying to promote the book. And I'm really grateful actually for this opportunity, precisely because I think that it's crucial that we focus a bit more on the younger generation, especially as I think the sort of the veneer or the idea that if you work hard you will succeed becomes I mean, this idea becomes more and more eroded. And, you know, to the point that I'll put it like this, I'm a millennial, as a millennial, I could feel disappointed because a promise was made to me. I don't think the younger generation could see that anymore.
Yeah, I was just talking about Martin Lewis, who was speaking at the LSE Festival yesterday, and I scribbled down on some post-it notes on my desk 3 quotes because they just blew me away. 100,000 people a year, you'd have to look up to find out the stats he's got a charity for mental health and financial problems. Can't remember the name of it at the top of my head. But 100,000 people a year have attempted to take their own lives because of financial pressures. 14% currently, I think, have taken their own lives in Britain, and over 50% of households in Britain are deficit budgeting, meaning that they have less income than their minimum expenditure. So something has gone very, very wrong, as we all know. But I thought those were, and he was asked, what do you think, what contribution have you made? And he was most proud of the work he's done with governments to improve recognition of mental health problems associated with financial difficulties. But that's pretty stark.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So a very big thank you again to you guys for giving up the time. Thank you to you for watching the video as well. Like and subscribe. We should have lots more coming soon. So yeah, see you later.
So much.
Thank you.